It was one of those Oxford evenings when the light seems reluctant to leave. The last of it clung stubbornly to the college spires, gilding them like half-forgotten saints, and the cobblestones glistened faintly from a drizzle that had passed almost unnoticed. I was walking back from the Randolph, coat unbuttoned, collar turned up against the faint chill, when the first stroke of the bell came from St. Aldate's. It was not the hour that caught me, though I've always been too aware of such things. But the tone. Something about it jarred, faintly and insistently, like a line of poetry with a missing syllable. Oxford is full of imperfect sounds. Doors that moan from centuries of use, bicycle wheels that squeak through puddles, and the restless hum of young voices floating from the pubs. But this was different. The bell lingered a half-beat too long, its echo muddied in the damp air. I paused beneath a lamp-post and looked toward the church tower. The light inside the slit windows flickered briefly. Candlelight, I thought, before vanishing. The street behind me was empty, save for a student in a long scarf reading an old notice pinned to the railing. The paper was faded, its edges curled. All Hallows Concert, postponed until further notice. The sort of postponement that becomes permanent. I might have walked on, but that flat tone stayed with me. One learns to live with such irritations. A mind like mine is cursed to notice dissonance, yet they settle in the blood. The drizzle returned, soft and persistent, blurring the reflections in the pavement. I lit a cigarette under the canopy of the old bookshop and watched the smoke rise and dissolve into the mist. A woman passed by with an umbrella tilted low, her shoes tapping unevenly. I remember thinking her rhythm matched the bell's mistake. There's a peculiar melancholy to Oxford in late October. The tourists thin, the students retreat indoors, and the city begins to hear itself again. The bells, the footsteps, the slow breathing of its stones. I often imagine the place as an old scholar who once lectured brilliantly but now mutters to himself, unable to stop. That night, as I walked past Christchurch Meadow, the air smelled of wet leaves and coal smoke. A taxi turned the corner near the gate, its headlights briefly touching the old memorial cross, and for a moment the wet stone gleamed red, like the residue of something half-remembered. I might have gone home, made tea, and let the evening vanish into another unremarkable entry in memory. But I lingered, listening. The bell tolled again, just once, almost experimentally, and then fell silent. Someone had been inside that tower, I was certain, and someone had stopped. I thought of Lewis, probably home with his wife, watching something comfortably dull on the telly. He would have smiled at my attention to such trivia. "A bell's a bell, sir," he'd have said. Not a confession. And yet I've learned that the smallest imperfections often speak the loudest truths. A false note, a misplaced comma, a silence held a fraction too long. They announce themselves to anyone listening closely enough. When I finally turned toward home, the rain had strengthened, and the air carried the metallic scent that follows thunder without the storm itself. I crossed the High, cutting through an alley where the stones were slick and narrow. The light from the lamp posts trembled on the puddles, like thoughts I couldn't quite hold still. Behind me, faintly, the bells sounded again. Softer this time, almost cautious. Before fading altogether, I told myself it was nothing, a slip of timing, a clapper loosened by years of neglect. Yet as I closed my door on that quiet night, I found the rhythm of the toll still echoing in my head. There are sounds one forgets easily, and others that insist upon return. This one would come back, unbidden, on darker nights to follow. The dull, mournful note of a bell that refused to ring true. I poured a small whiskey, more out of habit than need, and sat by the window as the rain thickened. Somewhere in the distance, St. Aldate's stood in shadow, its tower barely visible. I told myself I would have no cause to think of it again, but the mind, like music, remembers its discordances. and I knew, though I could not have said why, that the wrong note I had heard was only the beginning of a greater silence waiting to fall. The call came early, though I had been awake for hours, the kind of wakefulness that doesn't come from rest, but from unfinished thought. Rain pressed gently against the window pane, a fine, constant rhythm that suited the dull ache behind my eyes. When Lewis's voice reached through the receiver, hesitant, I already knew it wasn't about paperwork or schedules. There was a pause before he spoke the words. A body had been found inside the bell tower at St. Aldate's. I arrived just after dawn, the city still wrapped in its habitual mist. The church stood at the edge of the street like an old scholar who had forgotten what he was meant to teach. Police tape stretched across the entrance, incongruous against the dark oak door. Inside, the air smelled of stone and candle wax, a scent both sacred and decaying. The body lay at the base of the tower steps, twisted in the posture of someone who had once resisted the fall and then surrendered to it. Dr. Julian Greaves, Lewis told me, a historian from Merton. A fall, apparently. I studied the angle of the limbs, the delicate break in the skull, the absence of blood where it should have been. Death had come quickly, but perhaps not by accident. The bell ropes hung beside us, thick with dust, except one. Recently handled, the fibers faintly clean. A hymn book lay open on the floor, pages damp where the roof had leaked. Its title, printed in faded gold, read, "Songs of Penitence and Praise." Lewis bent down, examining footprints that led halfway up the stairs, and then vanished. Too few, too light. Someone had entered carefully. On the small wooden table by the vestry door sat a folded letter, unsent. I unfolded it delicately, reading the first line. My dearest Eleanor, I have finally understood what must be done. The ink had smudged, perhaps from a tear or the damp of the tower. The rest of the letter trailed off into something almost illegible, as if the writer had lost the courage to finish. Greaves had been a man of reputation, not fame, but the quieter form of respect given to those who collect knowledge like dust. His work on medieval music was said to be exacting, even obsessive. I'd read one of his papers once, an analysis of bell harmonics in early English churches. He had written that purity of sound was a form of faith. Perhaps it was. And perhaps it was that very faith that had brought him here, on a wet October night, to fall beneath the bell that no longer rang true. Lewis was speaking, his voice respectful, though tinged with the discomfort of standing too close to a body. The vicar had found him, he said, when he came to open the church for morning prayers. The door had been unlocked, the light in the tower still burning. I nodded, but my attention had drifted to the notebook near the pulpit. Its pages were filled with musical notation, though not music exactly. Codes of some sort, letters interlaced with symbols, as if the man had been composing not a song, but a confession. One line caught my eye. B flat to B natural. The fall of grace. It was written twice, underlined once. I copied it quietly into my own notebook. When I stepped outside, the rain had thinned to a faint drizzle. Across the street, a milk lorry rumbled past, indifferent to tragedy. I stood a while under the archway, watching the sky pale from grey to ash. I had seen too many deaths to feign surprise, but there was something in this one that unsettled me. Not the violence of it, but the care. The deliberate stillness with which the scene had been left, as though someone wanted to be heard without speaking. Lewis asked if we should begin canvassing the area. I said yes, of course, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I kept hearing that imperfect toll from the night before, that half-tone slipping into silence. There are deaths that announce themselves not in screams or sirens, but in echoes. And I knew then that what had happened in the tower was not an ending, but an overture. Merton was half asleep when we arrived, its quads still veiled in a thin morning mist that rose from the damp lawns like memory, itself refusing to settle. There's something about Oxford colleges that always feels faintly theatrical at dawn. Too composed, too quiet, as though their stones are pretending innocence after a night of whispered conspiracies. I've never trusted the kind of silence that smells of old paper and ambition. Lewis walked beside me with his usual mixture of curiosity and reluctance, the kind of look reserved for museum exhibits that might unexpectedly come to life. He'd never admit it, but the colleges unnerved him. The clipped voices, the coded manners, the way even guilt wore tweed and spoke in subjunctives. I found it oddly comforting, perhaps because I too had learned to hide behind words. Dr. Livia Parham was waiting in her study, a room so austere it seemed curated to discourage sentiment. She was elegant in the way only the perpetually disappointed can be. Her books stood in flawless order, her desk an altar of tidiness. She greeted us with a thin smile that implied not warmth, but the exhaustion of tolerance. Greaves, she said, had been a colleague, sometimes a friend. Their work overlapped. He had been a perfectionist. A dangerous thing, she added, in any field that worships truth. I asked when she had last seen him. She looked past me, to the window where ivy traced thin green veins across the stone. 3 nights ago, she said. He came to discuss a psalter we were both examining. He left abruptly. I assumed irritation. That was all. Her voice was calm, too calm. But there was a flicker, almost imperceptible, when Lewis mentioned the time of death. Her hand brushed the edge of her sleeve as though steadying something invisible. I'd seen that gesture before, in witnesses who believed they'd concealed more than they had. The porter who'd found the key to the tower was waiting in the hall when we left. He was a small man, apologetic by instinct. Said he'd seen Dr. Greaves pass through the gate that evening, but not alone. There had been another figure, cloaked perhaps. He wasn't sure. 2 sets of footsteps, he muttered, the echo chasing itself along the stones. It had sounded, he said, as if one followed unwillingly. I made a note, though I trusted his memory less than the architecture that framed it. Still, echoes are peculiar things. They preserve not truth but rhythm, and rhythm, I've learned, can reveal intention. We walked back through the quad. The chapel bell began to chime the hour, pure this time, unmarred. I caught myself counting the notes, half expecting that same uneven tone I'd heard from St. Aldate's. But it was flawless, almost reproachful. Perfection can sound dishonest when one's been listening for flaws. Lewis asked whether I thought Greaves had fallen or been pushed. I told him both seemed possible, though neither felt complete. Deaths like these rarely balance on simple choices. I asked if he'd noticed the inscription on Parham's desk blotter, Veritas non semper libere canit. Truth does not always sing freely. He hadn't. I almost envied him that. Back at the car, I opened the notebook we'd taken from the vestry and turned again to the coded notations. B flat to B natural. A fall of grace. Beneath it, faintly penciled, a name. Parham. I said nothing. Lewis hummed tunelessly, some pop melody mangled by the morning air. When we drove away, I glanced once more at the college tower receding behind us. The fog had thickened, blurring the sharp lines of its spire until it looked almost spectral. There are places in Oxford where sound lingers long after the source has ceased, where a voice, a bell, a sigh can drift across years without ever quite dying. Merton was one of them. And as the car turned onto the high, I found myself listening, absurdly, for those footsteps the porter had described, echoing faintly against the stone, repeating something that none of us yet understood. It was the sound of boys' voices that drew me back to St. Aldate's, that thin, unbroken purity which makes one feel absurdly that innocence might still exist somewhere in the world. The choir was rehearsing for evensong, their notes rising through the cold air like fragile glass bubbles, doomed to burst upon the stone vaulting. I stood in the shadows by the vestry door, listening. The smallest among them sang slightly flat on the final Amen, and the choir master frowned without looking up. Perfection, once again, demanded obedience. Afterward, the boys filed out in their cassocks, laughter quickly replacing reverence. Only one lingered, a slight boy with pale hair, perhaps 13, clutching his music folder as if it were a shield. Lewis had spoken to him earlier, I remembered, the child who had heard the bell toll when no bell should have rung. I called him over, quietly. His name was Andrew. He looked at me as children do when they sense the adult world hovering too close. He said he had been locking the music cupboard that night when he heard the bell strike once, just after midnight. Not a proper chime, he said, more like a cough. He'd thought perhaps it was the wind, but then he'd seen the flicker, a candle or a torch, high in the tower slit. His voice dropped when he said it. He'd been afraid to tell anyone. People laughed when choir boys talked of ghosts. I asked what he'd been singing that evening. He thought for a moment before replying, "Miserere mei Deus, have mercy upon me, O God." He said it with the gravity of someone who didn't yet understand guilt, but already feared it. I thanked him and watched him walk away across the nave, his small shoes tapping out a rhythm that seemed to echo far longer than they should have. When the door closed, I stood alone again. The church was cold, the air tinged with that peculiar scent of candle soot and rain-soaked stone. I walked to the tower steps. A faint layer of chalk dust still marked the floor. Disturbed recently, perhaps by the boy's own wandering, perhaps not. On the lowest stair I noticed something small, a folded scrap of paper, half hidden under a hymn book. I opened it. A single line written in pencil, "Forgive what must be hidden." No name. The handwriting delicate, tremulous. Greaves's hand, perhaps, though even that I could not be certain. Later, in the pub, Lewis spoke of practicalities, autopsy results, statements, the vicar's alibi. I heard him distantly, my attention drawn instead to a woman at the far table humming to herself, a hymn I recognized, but not quite. She hummed the line in a minor key that didn't belong. It was enough to unsettle me. Music, like memory, betrays its keepers. I found myself sketching the words from the scrap in my notebook beneath the earlier line about B-flat and B-natural. Forgive what must be hidden. The two phrases seemed to speak to each other, though I couldn't yet decipher the conversation. The first was confession, the second, justification. Somewhere between them lay motive. That evening I returned once more to the church. Habit, perhaps, or curiosity masquerading as reverence. The candles had been extinguished, yet faint wax drips marked a trail along the pew rail. Recent, irregular. At the pulpit, the faint smell of perfume lingered. Not the cheap sweetness of visitors, but something heavier, deliberate. Someone had been there, waiting or remembering. Outside, the city was still. The rain had ceased, leaving the flagstones slick and gleaming beneath the lamplight. As I locked the gate behind me, I thought again of the boy's whisper, how he'd said a cough, not a chime, a bell that tried and failed to sound its truth. There was something unbearably human in that. I walked home slowly, the phrase turning over in my mind. In a crossword, every answer hides beneath misdirection, yet it's the smallest word, the if, the or, the and, that shifts meaning entirely. Perhaps the same was true of death. Perhaps Greaves had left behind not a confession, but a correction. That night, long after the city had gone quiet, I dreamt I heard the bell again. Not loud, but hollow, as if struck from within by someone who could no longer tell whether he sought absolution or simply wanted to be heard. Funerals, I found, are less about the dead than about what the living refuse to confess. The one held for Dr. Greaves was no exception. The church was crowded, though I doubted half the mourners could have named a single work of his. Scholars came for reputation, widows for custom, I for curiosity. The autumn light filtered through the stained glass with that peculiar English mercy that forgives nothing and illuminates everything. It was during the final hymn that I saw her, the woman in the black velvet hat. She stood apart near the rear pews, face turned slightly away from the light. Even at a distance, there was something deliberate in her stillness, an elegance that felt more like restraint. After the service, she lingered until the others had drifted out. When she finally approached the coffin, her gloved hand brushed the edge for no more than a moment, a gesture of possession, not farewell. Outside, under the bare yews, Lewis murmured that she was the widow, Eleanor Greaves, estranged according to parish gossip. Lived somewhere near Woodstock. Quiet means no children. I told him to fetch the car, though what drew me forward wasn't duty, but the faint perfume that lingered as she passed. Violet, with the powdery sadness of something once fashionable. I found her by the gate, adjusting her gloves with unnecessary care. She seemed unsurprised when I addressed her. Her voice was low, almost musical. She said she hadn't seen Julian for months, perhaps longer. They had parted amicably, a word that never means what it pretends to. He'd been unwell, she said, too long absorbed in his research, too contemptuous of ordinary life. I asked if she had been in Oxford recently. She hesitated, a pause so brief most would have missed it. I didn't. When she finally met my eyes, her calm was complete again. She denied visiting him, though I noticed the faintest trace of white dust at the hem of her glove. Chalk, or perhaps the residue of old stone, the kind one might find on a spiral stair. Lewis, returning, muttered something about her elegance. I said nothing. Beauty, I've learned, is never innocent in the aftermath of tragedy. Later that afternoon, I sat in Greaves's study, the room left precisely as it had been, books in symmetrical disarray, a decanter of port half empty, dust motes suspended in a beam of thin light. On his desk lay a photograph. A younger Eleanor seated in a garden, her eyes directed not at the camera, but at something beyond it. I turned it over. No inscription, no date. Only the faint indentation of another photograph once pressed against it. Among his papers, I found another letter, half-written and torn. The handwriting wavered near the end. I am sorry for what I allowed to be done. You were right about the silence beneath the music. Beneath that, a smudge, as though from a fingertip dragged through ink. The torn edge was rough, the missing piece nowhere to be seen. At twilight, I walked once more to St. Aldate's. The bell tower loomed above, its stone now a deeper gray, almost bruised by the fading light. In the gravel near the entrance, a single footprint, smaller than Greaves's, the impression faint but sharp enough to reveal a pointed heel, the sort of shoe a woman might wear, though not for comfort. Lewis would have called it coincidence. He always did. But coincidences, like harmonies, depend on timing. Too neat a pattern, and the human hand begins to show. I stood for a while, listening. Somewhere in the upper chamber, the wind moved through the ropes, producing a hollow, uncertain tone. A bell that wanted to speak but had forgotten its own voice. As I turned away, I thought again of the woman in black velvet. Her composure, her careful pauses, the dust on her glove. She had touched something that night, I was certain. Whether it was love, guilt, or the past, I could not yet tell. But she had left her trace behind, as all of us do, on the stones of Oxford, those patient keepers of our better lies. Some cases drift like music played from another room. Faint, incomplete, the melody always just beyond reach. This one was beginning to sound like that. Too many notes missing, too many rests between the beats. The death of Dr. Julian Greaves had stopped being an event and become something else, a dissonance that refused to resolve. Lewis and I met in the church again that morning. The rain had followed us in, dotting the flagstones with dark patches that looked from a distance like shadows cast by invisible figures. The place smelled of candle grease and damp hymnals. He told me the forensic report was in. The injuries were consistent with a fall. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, all very tidy, too tidy. He asked what I thought. I said I thought of Bach. He looked puzzled, as he always did when I dragged music into murder. I told him that in certain fugues, harmony is created not by perfection, but by friction, by the meeting of two notes that shouldn't coexist. Perhaps that was true of people, too. Greaves and Parham. Greaves and his wife. Greaves and truth. Later at headquarters, I read the report again. Fingerprints on the letter were Greaves alone. No foreign prints on the stair rail, the ropes, or the notebook. Even the torn page had yielded nothing useful. But it wasn't the absence of evidence that troubled me. It was the neatness of it all, the kind of cleanliness that only occurs when someone has wiped away the mess. That evening, I walked alone through the quadrangles near Merton. The rain had become a thin mist, soft as dust. Light glowed behind high windows, the kind of amber light that belongs to scholars and insomniacs. I found Parham's office still lit. She didn't seem surprised to see me. Her manner was courteous, detached, as if I were another lecture she'd once given and forgotten. She spoke of Greaves again, of his talent and his vanity. She said he had been composing an article that might have embarrassed certain benefactors, though she pretended ignorance of the details. Her tone, however, held that familiar strain of superiority that disguises fear. I asked whether she'd ever rung the bells at St. Aldate's. She smiled faintly, a smile without warmth, and said she didn't believe in rituals, yet her right hand trembled slightly when she reached for her glass. It was then I noticed the small scar on her wrist, a thin white crescent that caught the lamplight. Old, but not ancient. Perhaps nothing. But I wrote it down later all the same. When I left, the porter stopped me. Said Dr. Parham often worked late, but not that night. He'd seen her leave around 9, wearing a dark coat and carrying no books. I asked if she'd said where she was going. He shook his head, but mentioned something odd. The college clock had chimed 12 at 10:30. A fault in the mechanism, no doubt, or another false harmony. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and stared at the case notes spread across the table. The music notation in Greaves's notebook looked less like code now and more like a lament. B-flat to B natural. The fall of grace. The transition between those two notes had always fascinated me. A semitone of difference, barely perceptible, yet enough to change the mood entirely from sorrow to serenity or back again. That was what I had missed until then. The subtle shift, the falsity so slight it sounded true. The bell had rung wrong, yes, but deliberately wrong. A false harmony to disguise something beneath. I didn't yet know what or who had struck that note. Only that whoever did had an ear for deception and a conscience tuned just sharp enough to ache. Outside, the bells of Oxford began to ring the hour. Perfect, balanced, and utterly lifeless. I listened, waiting for one to falter. None did. The city, like its sins, had learned to keep in tune. There are moments in an investigation when the world seems to pause, not in revelation, but in recognition. That afternoon in the Bodleian, surrounded by the dust of centuries and the polite decay of scholarship, I felt the air change in just that way. The librarian, a woman of indeterminate age and infinite discretion, handed me the request ledger as though it were a sacred relic. Dr. Julian Greaves had signed it 4 days before his death. The title written in his precise, almost calligraphic hand, Cantus Umbrae, the Song of Shadows. The entry should have been unremarkable. Scholars request obscure psalters daily, usually to dispute one another over authorship or to resurrect some forgotten Latin phrase. But Cantus Umbrae was not listed in any catalogue. It existed, apparently, only in memory. And memory, as I've come to learn, is the most deceitful archivist of all. The librarian frowned when I asked for the volume. It had gone missing, she said, though not stolen. Mis-shelved, perhaps. Returned and misplaced. These things happened, but her voice carried the tremor of someone protecting more than just books. She recalled that Dr. Livia Parham had examined the same manuscript not long before. Her handwriting, unlike Greaves's, was nervous and angular. I could almost hear the scratch of her pen, impatient, self-correcting. I walked across the reading room, the echo of my footsteps swallowed by the high vaulting. Students bent over their papers with the anxious reverence of those who still believed truth could be earned through diligence. I had believed that once. I paused by the window. Outside, the rain had begun again, slanting against the stone mullions like faint handwriting. Lewis appeared, his coat already damp. He said Parham had agreed to meet us in her rooms that evening. Something in his tone suggested reluctance. He disliked her, though he would never say so aloud. She made him feel provincial, I think, too solid for her fragile games of intellect and insinuation. When we arrived, her fire was lit, and the air smelled of damp wool and tobacco. She seemed less guarded than before, though that, I suspected, was its own kind of theatre. The missing psalter, she said, had been part of a minor academic disagreement. Greaves had insisted it was authentic. She had claimed it a forgery. The argument had turned personal, as such disputes often do. Truth, after all, is rarely the point, only ownership. She gestured toward a pile of papers on her desk. Among them I noticed a thin folio wrapped in brown paper. I pretended not to. Instead, I asked what Cantus Umbrae meant to her. A curiosity, she replied. A riddle, a prayer. Take your pick. Greaves, she added, had always been drawn to things that could not be proven. I let my eyes drift to the piano in the corner. A single sheet of music lay open, its staves filled with neat notation. The melody was simple, almost childlike, yet the final bar ended unresolved, a cadence withheld. False harmonies again. When I remarked on it, she smiled faintly. Some endings, she said, are better left unfinished. Lewis was fidgeting by the window, uncomfortable in the charged stillness. I asked him to fetch the car. When the door closed behind him, I looked back at the desk. The brown paper was gone. Parham's hands rested lightly on her lap. She watched me as one might a slow-burning candle, patiently, knowing it would consume itself without help. Before leaving, I noticed a book on her shelf, a collection of John Donne's sermons. One passage, underlined in fading ink, caught my eye. There is music in every silence, if only we have learned to hear it. I said nothing. Deduction often arrives not through logic, but through the quiet alignment of unrelated things. The pause between words, the hesitation of a glance, the faint residue of chalk on a glove. That night, back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and opened Greaves' notebook once more. Beneath the cryptic line about the fall of grace, I added a single word: shadow. The meaning was unclear, yet it felt inevitable. Somewhere in that lost manuscript, or in the mind of the woman who denied it, a truth waited, unvoiced but perfectly pitched. Outside, the rain thickened, erasing the city one cobblestone at a time. And from the far side of Oxford, I thought I heard a bell toll once. Not wrong this time, but weary, as though exhausted by its own memory. There are nights when the city seems to breathe differently, slower, uncertain, as though Oxford itself were waiting to be forgiven. That evening, I found myself back in Greaves' flat, a narrow book-lined room that still held his scent, pipe smoke, dust, and something faintly medicinal. The constable had left the key under the mat, and I let myself in with the care one reserves for trespass. I switched on the lamp, its shade stained amber with age. On the desk, among the detritus of interrupted thought, stood a small tape recorder. Lewis had mentioned it, dismissed it. Old, obsolete, probably blank. But I've learned to distrust what looks obsolete. I pressed play. At first, there was nothing but hiss. Then, faintly, the sound of a bell, the same imperfect toll I had heard that first night, distorted by distance. Beneath it, another noise emerged, the scrape of movement, a breath, then a voice. Barely audible, the words blurring into the static. He knew. I froze, rewound, played it again. He knew. 2 syllables, the second almost lost. The whisper carried a softness that could have been sorrow or fear. I thought of Eleanor Greaves, her calm defiance, her ungloved hand resting briefly on the coffin. It could have been her voice, or memory playing its own tricks. Outside, the rain had begun again, brushing against the window like fingers. I sat in the half-dark, listening to that whisper over and over until the phrase became meaningless, the way a word dissolves when spoken too often. Yet the tone remained, hollow, as if spoken not to confess, but to echo. Lewis arrived the next morning, yawning, cheerful in that irritating way that youth manages to be cheerful around death. I told him about the tape. He frowned, skeptical, as though the dead had no right to speak after we'd filed them away. He said it was interference. The wind. A flaw in the tape. He was probably right. The trouble is, I've always trusted flaws more than perfection. Later, I took a walk along the river. The rain had cleared, leaving behind that thin brightness peculiar to early November. Neither light nor shadow, but the pause between them. I thought about Greaves's obsession with dissonance, with music that refused resolution. Perhaps his death had been its own unfinished chord. Perhaps someone had merely played the final note for him. When I returned, I played the tape again, this time listening beyond the whisper. There was a faint rustle just before it. Paper, perhaps, or fabric brushing against stone. Then the bell again, 1 beat later than the rhythm should allow. A deliberate delay. I wrote it down in my notebook. 1 second late. It seemed trivial, but I couldn't let it go. Bells are measured things. They mark time, not emotion. If a note falters, it's because someone has altered the mechanism, or the man striking it has paused, however briefly, to decide. That evening, I visited Eleanor once more. She was sitting in a drawing room that smelled faintly of violets and rain-damp wood. She asked if the investigation was nearing its end. I said nothing, only watched her trace a finger along the rim of her teacup. Her movements were graceful, rehearsed, yet at one point she lifted her left hand and winced slightly. A burn, thin, pale, crescent-shaped, the sort one might earn from hot metal. I noted it silently. Before leaving, she asked what kind of man her husband had been in his final days. I said I thought he had been searching for a harmony he'd once heard and lost. She smiled at that, though not kindly. Some things, she said, are better unheard. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey, darker than usual, and played the tape once more. He knew. This time I caught the faintest trace of echo following the phrase. The same hollow resonance I'd heard in St. Aldate's. A voice layered beneath its own reflection. I turned off the recorder. The silence that followed was almost comforting, almost kind. Yet somewhere beyond it, I imagined the bell waiting, poised, breath held, for the hand that would strike the final note. It was a little after 11 when I found myself again beneath the Bodleian's shadow, the air still and sharp as a freshly cut quill. The library after hours has a presence unlike any other, not silence, but a low pulse of withheld breath. It seemed fitting somehow that the truth, or whatever portion of it I was allowed, should live among those shelves where human vanity has always mistaken itself for permanence. The librarian met me at the side entrance, a cautious woman with the sort of politeness that masks perpetual worry. She carried a torch and an apology. Someone, she said, had returned the missing psalter, Cantus Umbrae, that morning, though no one had seen who left it. The parcel had been placed quietly upon her desk, its wrapping still damp from rain. She led me through the reading room. The great ceiling vanished into shadow, and our footsteps were the only sound. The manuscript lay waiting in its brown paper, unmarked, but for a faint ring, the ghost of a wineglass or a candle base. I loosened the twine. The cover was ancient calfskin, worn smooth, the color of extinguished fire. Inside, the Latin text flowed in the elegant, unsmiling hand of a monk who had never imagined his words might someday return as evidence. But it wasn't the manuscript itself that caught me. Between its final pages lay a loose leaf. Newer, its edges still sharp, the ink not yet faded. A translation, written in Greaves's own careful script. Or perhaps not quite a translation, more an interpretation. It began as verse, then faltered into confession. I have changed the note so the sin might sound holy. Forgive me, though the bell must fall. He had signed nothing, but the rhythm of the words carried his mind unmistakably. The same symmetry, the same hunger for grace. I read it twice before I noticed something else. Faint indentations across the lower margin, the kind that occur when one sheet lies beneath another during writing. I tilted it toward the lamplight. There, invisible ink pressed into paper by pressure alone, were the letters of a name. Livia. Lewis, when I showed him, called it what it was. Evidence of an affair, perhaps a quarrel. He said it without malice, almost kindly. I envied his certainty. To him, cause and effect were the rails along which the world must run. But for me, every name was a note in an unfinished composition, and every confession a harmony written too late. Later, alone again, I studied the psalter more closely. On the flyleaf, in the faintest pencil, was a marginal annotation, not medieval, but recent, a small line of verse. Between the bell and the breath lies the fault. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably feminine. I imagined Parham sitting here weeks ago, her pen hovering, her conscience hovering with it. It was then, I think, that the pattern began to take shape. Not clearly, but like a reflection seen through rippling water. The bell, the fall, the silence. A man burdened by deceit. A woman bound to him by knowledge, not affection. Another woman circling his ruin, perhaps to save him, perhaps to witness the collapse she had long foreseen. The tragedy was not in what had been done, but in the music of its inevitability. I signed the library register before leaving, my own name curling beneath Greaves's as if time had folded in on itself. Outside, midnight had come. The city lay half submerged in fog, lamps glowing dimly as though lit beneath water. Somewhere far off, a bell began to sound, not St. Aldate's this time, but Christ Church. Its chime was perfect, pure, unbroken. Yet after hearing the hollow one, perfection felt dishonest. When I reached my flat, I placed the translation beside my crossword, half finished from the morning. One clue had waited all day unanswered. Note that hides its flaw. 5. I wrote it in before sleep took me. Minor. I woke later to the sound of rain on glass, the kind that falls as though it knows where it's been before, and in that moment I thought again of Greaves's line. The bell must fall. Whether he meant the instrument or the man himself, I still couldn't say. Perhaps, as with most truths, both were the same. I returned to St. Aldate's that night, though I told no one. The instinct was not professional, but something lonelier. The quiet need to stand where a man's last sound had been made. The city was empty, its pavements slick with recent rain, lamps burning like patient eyes. The church loomed ahead, familiar now, yet no less watchful. I let myself in with the key the vicar had trusted me to keep. The lock turned too easily, as though expecting me. The air inside was heavy with cold stone and the faint sweetness of extinguished wax. I switched on, no light. The tower steps waited, spiraling upward into shadow. Each one creaked with the soft complaint of age. Halfway up, I paused and looked down. The nave below was a dark geometry. Pews aligned like an unfinished equation. Somewhere above, the bell's great shape hung in silence, its bulk invisible but certain. I found the small table where Greaves's notebook had once rested, now cleared. Only the echo of its absence remained. I sat for a while on the bottom step, listening. The city's noise had thinned to nothing. Then faintly, I heard it. Not the toll of metal, but the whisper of air moving through the tower slits. It made a sound like breathing. I switched on my torch. Dust spiraled in the beam, and there, in the thin layer covering the floor, a new trail of prints. Not mine. Smaller, sharper, the heel narrowing delicately. Eleanor's, perhaps, or another who had come seeking what I sought. I followed them upward. At the top, the bell waited. Even in the half-light, it seemed alive. Not an object, but a creature that had once sung and now sulked in silence. On its rim, I saw it. The faint smear of chalk, where someone had written and half-erased a phrase. I bent closer. Forgive me for the false note. It was not Greaves's hand. The writing leaned forward, almost hurried, feminine. I closed my eyes and could see her there, Eleanor or Parham, or perhaps some ghost of both, standing in the darkness, tracing those words before walking away. Confession, apology, or absolution. It hardly mattered which. When I descended, I paused at the halfway landing and looked toward the vestry. A thin glimmer of moonlight fell across the brass candlesticks. Beside them, a folded piece of paper, my name written upon it. Inside, a single sentence in that same small, urgent hand. He did not fall alone. There was no signature, though I didn't need one. The words were not accusation, but explanation. The kind one leaves when explanation has lost its use. I put the note in my pocket, though I knew I would never show it to Lewis, or anyone. Outside, the sky had cleared. The bells of other churches were beginning to mark midnight, a chorus of clean, unwavering tones. Only St. Aldate's remained mute, its great mouth sealed against repentance. I stood there a long time, waiting for the sound that never came. When at last I turned to leave, I noticed a glint on the path. A thin chain, broken, its clasp bent. I picked it up. A pendant hung from it, a small tuning fork, silver, worn at the edges. I struck it gently against the stone. It gave off a pure tone, soft yet flawless. No false harmonies here, only truth, cold and brief. Later, in my flat, I placed it beside my whiskey glass. The note it had made still hovered somewhere in the room, faint but steady. I thought of Greaves, of his obsession with purity of sound, of the bell's imperfection, of the woman who had tried, perhaps, to silence it. They had sought harmony and found only consequence. I turned out the light and sat there, listening to the quiet hum beneath the quiet. It was almost music. And somewhere within it, though I could not tell if from memory or imagination, I heard again the whisper from the tape. He knew. This time, the voice no longer sounded hollow. It sounded at peace. I did not expect her to come. Yet when the doorbell rang that evening, soft and undecided, I knew before I opened it that it would be Eleanor Greaves. She stood there without a coat, rain gathering on her shoulders like a penance she had chosen not to refuse. Her face was pale, unpainted, the mask gone. She said she needed to speak, and I stepped aside. Inside, she did not sit. Her eyes roamed the room as though trying to find a place where she could rest her guilt. I poured her a whiskey. She didn't touch it, and waited. The clock napper. The mantelpiece ticked too loudly. At last, she said that truth was rarely a single sound. Sometimes it was a chord no ear could hold without trembling. I told her I already knew that. She spoke of the night in the tower. Julian had summoned her there, she said, to show her something, a final proof that his work had meaning. But when she arrived, she found him different, calm, resigned, almost tender. He spoke of atonement, of false notes, of lies preserved in parchment. He had falsified a translation, she said, to secure a grant, to silence Parham's criticism. The bell he intended to ring at midnight was to mark his confession, not to the church, nor to her, but to time itself. She paused, the kind of pause that lasts longer than memory. He climbed to the platform, she continued. She followed, afraid of what he might do. They argued. One word led to another, then a silence. He reached for the rope, she for his arm. His foot slipped. The bell sounded once, that hollow, imperfect tone, and he was gone. She looked at me then, not pleading, but asking to be believed. There was a steadiness in her voice that betrayed its own truth. I asked why she had left the message in the tower, why she had returned to write "Forgive me" for the false note. She smiled faintly. Because guilt, she said, is never a solo performance. I wanted to ask if Parham knew, if she too had played her part in this quiet requiem, but Eleanor had already withdrawn into that unreachable space where the condemned wait for sleep. She said the police report could remain unchanged. Let it be accident, she murmured. The truth would make no difference now. When she left, I did not follow. The door closed softly, as though careful not to disturb the dead. I stood a long time by the window, watching the rain return. Somewhere in the distance, the city bells began to chime. None of them faltered. Later that night, I walked once more to St. Aldate's. The streets were slick, the cobblestones reflecting the weak lamps like shards of glass. The church stood open, perhaps deliberately so. Inside, the air was still. I climbed the tower, not quickly, not reverently, but as a man climbs toward an answer he doesn't want to find. At the summit, the bell hung quiet. I placed my hand on its rim. Cold metal, patient as judgment. I could still see the faint chalk where her words had been, half erased now by rain and time. Beneath my fingers, the surface trembled, not with sound, but with memory. I thought of Lewis, who would call it closure, of Parham, who would never confess, of Eleanor, whose silence would be her absolution. I had no sermon to offer, no verdict, only the understanding that the purest music is often made of unfinished notes. When I finally left, the first light of morning had begun to dull the stars. I turned once, listening. The wind moved through the tower, carrying with it a faint echo, not of words, but of intention. And for a moment I imagined that the bell had spoken, not to mourn or accuse, but to forgive.